You're listening to a special Cinema Cities audio story. In this installment, I'm going to tell the story behind a war story. In the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but Allied forces continued the relentless fight across the Pacific. And at home, Americans braced for the looming possibility that their troops would be involved in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. That June, William Wellman's film The Story of G.I. Joe premiered. Starring Robert Mitchum and Burgess Meredith, the film also featured Sicily, Italy, and North African campaign veterans as themselves. The story was an adaptation of the collected frontline dispatches of war correspondent Ernie Pyle, taken from material gathered from Pyle's two books, Here Is Your War and Brave Men. Wellman was the first choice director of both Ernie Pyle and the film's producer Jerome Cowan, but Wellman initially had no interest in the film. By 1945, Wellman was a well-respected Hollywood director. He was behind such hits as Wings, the first film to win the Best Picture Academy Award, and A Star is Born. But he'd had some flops as well, most recently with 20th Century Fox's The Oxbow Incident. Now considered a classic, the film was panned and ignored upon its initial release. Wellman, like Pyle, had been on the front lines of war. Nicknamed Wild Bill, he'd run off to France in 1916 to join the now legendary Lafayette Flying Corps, a group of American volunteers who served with the French Air Service during the First World War before the United States' entrance into the conflict. As a World War I pursuit pilot, Wellman, in his own way, had developed a disdain for the infantry, and unfortunately for producer Jerome Cowan, The Story of G.I. Joe was the story of American infantrymen. How Wellman ended up behind the camera on The Story of G.I. Joe is a raucous, poignant, and intensely emotional story that he recounts in great detail in his 1974 autobiography, A Short Time for Insanity. And that is the story that I'm going to tell to you today, in Wellman's own words. I answered the ring. The stranger on the other side of the door introduced himself as Jerome Cowan, producer of motion pictures. I had never even heard about him, but he came in without being invited and took over. Said he was preparing a picture to be called G.I. Joe, written by Ernie Pyle. This stopped me from throwing the bum out. He told me how much he had admired my work and that he and Ernie had decided I was the man to direct this story of the Doughfoot. Finally, he ran out of breath and I politely declined the great honor that they would bestow on me. It was like water off a duck's back to Mr. Cowan. He wouldn't take no and kept arguing until finally I shut him up and told him the truth. I was not interested in working my ass off for the infantry. I was a pursuit pilot in the First War, and for a long stretch was assigned to nothing but close-to-ground work. My buddy Tommy Hitchcock and I, we shot up more aerodromes, made passes at advancing infantry, dropped President Wilson's message to Congress in the frontline trenches, did every dirty job that came along. And with the infantry, we flyers were not too popular. They said we led such an easy, clean life, my ass. In short, you know where you can stick the infantry, and in slow motion. There was such a fury behind this that I frightened him into getting the hell out of my house. That was that, I thought. A few days later, my doorbell rang, and I answered it. There he was again, this time with a letter in his hand, which he asked me to read. I wanted to know why I should read the goddamn letter, and he said because Ernie Pyle wrote it. Now, I didn't know Ernie then. Naturally, I had heard about him, but had not bothered to read any of his writings because they touched on but one subject. The infantry. And to me, that was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. So I slammed the door in his face, and I thought that was the end of Mr. Cowan. 3 or 4 days later, my doorbell rang again. I answered it, and there was that man again, this time playing Santa Claus. He had so many packages in his arms, I asked him who the hell he was delivering for. And he had an answer. For your kids. All of them. Pat, Bill, Kitty, Tim, Sissy, Mike, and Maggie. The son of bitch even knew their names. Wait a minute. I'm a little ahead of myself. Scratch Mike and Maggie. There were only 5 then. This time I really let him have it. I told him in well-chosen 4-letter words to get out and this time stay away or so help me, I'd put him in the hospital. That night, a long-distance call from Albuquerque. It was Ernie Pyle. That Cowan was a persistent bastard. I got on the phone, and Ernie said, "You won't remember me, but we met a couple of years ago." I didn't remember. He said that Lester called and told him about his interesting experiences with me, that I had refused point blank to even discuss the story. I told him that was true, and then he invited me to come to his home and spend a few days. He was sure that I would change my mind after I had given him a chance to tell the story and to make me realize the great need for such a picture and what it would mean to the thousands of kids that were fighting for his and my country. He damn near had me crying on the phone. 2 days later, I landed in Albuquerque, and there he was, all alone, waiting for me. He wasn't very big, maybe 125 pounds. Not the kind of guy you would imagine fooling around the front lines, living the hard, brutal reality of personal participation in the war. We shook hands. He told me he was glad and that I would give him the opportunity to convince me that I should make G.I. Joe the important and successful picture he knew it could be. I told him that I didn't convince very easily, and that some of my strongest convictions had resulted in very weak pictures. Weak is hardly the word, lousy would be more fitting. We climbed into his old Chevy, and on the way to his home, he reminded me of the time, place, and reason for our meeting some few years ago. He had been writing a column of everyday happenings for a small chain of equally small newspapers. He said it didn't amount to much. That was all he could get. Yet he had great pride in his work and occasionally managed to write something that had a meaning, a purpose, an idea. Some screwy flyer that had flown with me when I made Wings in 1926 in San Antonio told Ernie about some of his experiences, good and bad, with the so-called Wild Bill Wellman. For some daffy reason, Ernie's curiosity was aroused, and he did a little research on me and found that I was shooting A Star is Born. What appealed to him was the way and the wherefore that made a director out of a crazy ex-flyer. He arranged an interview and arrived on one of the sets at the David Selznick Studios in Culver City. Had a short few minutes between takes to ask Wellman some questions. Got a lot of not-too-brilliant replies and a distinct feeling that Wellman was not particularly fond of newspaper people. He did not get the slightest clue of the why and the wherefore, and as a result, he wrote a not-too-brilliant story for his column. He did remember, however, that when it came time to go, Wellman was most polite, very thankful, and extremely relieved. He asked me if I remembered him now. I said vaguely, and if I had happened to read the article. I said yes. And what did you think of it? I said I thought his writing had improved. Silence. We rode on for a few minutes, then he turned to me and said, "You know, most guys would have taken the easy way out and told me that they liked the article very much. I appreciate what you said, and I am most flattered." We turned into the driveway of one of the many houses on the street, all almost identical, same-size lots, same-style houses, all FHA projects. As Ernie said, the only difference was that his house had just been painted by himself, and he had no garage, or rather, he had made his garage into a guest room. His car stayed out. It had been doing this for 5 years and had become acclimated. We went inside, I sat down, and we had a drink, and then I met Mrs. Pyle. It was very strange. She seemed ill at ease, almost frightened, and stayed for just a moment, excused herself, and left the room. I thought I saw a slight stagger. Ernie had acted in an odd sort of way, and for some unknown reason I felt embarrassed. I stayed there for 2 nights and 2 days, but I saw her only once more, and then not even to speak to. Ernie and I ate dinner at a comfy little home-cooked diner-style cafe. Apparently he dined there frequently, for they treated him like he was one of the family. We talked of flying, of movie-making, of my wife and 5 kids, as a group and individually, but not one word about Ernie, his experiences, or G.I. Joe. During the meal, I saw 2 GIs who had recognized Ernie, though his back was to them. I could tell they were talking about him from their frequent glances in his direction. Unknowingly, this was to be my first baptism of the greatness of this little giant of the GIs. When we were halfway through our dinner, the 2 GIs got up and left. Just before they passed to the door, they took a last look at Ernie and said a few words to each other. I felt that they wanted to come over and talk to him, but thought that perhaps this wasn't the time or the place. Not right in the middle of a man's dinner. I'll never forget the expression on their faces when they looked at Ernie. We finished our dinner, and I finished most of the talking. Then we went outside, and there they were. Not only the 2 GIs that had spotted Ernie in the cafe, but 9 or 10 more, a few with books under their arms, in their hands, or stuck in their belts. This was not the movie-type charge of squealing autograph hunters. They didn't even move. They just stood there, eyes riveted on Ernie, waiting and hoping that he would notice them. He did and went over. I decided to remain where I was, feeling that a stranger in their midst might become a little embarrassing to them. So I witnessed a pantomimic ritual that I will never forget. Ernie shook hands with them all. You could tell that they asked him to autograph the books, and I suddenly realized that they were probably copies of Ernie's Here Is Your War or maybe his latest, Brave Men. He asked each of the boys their names, made a few more inquiries, held a brief little talk with each one, and then wrote us something in each book. It was not the usual best regards Ernie Pyle stuff. He took time and wrote each a little note. When he had finished, he said goodbye to them with a funny half-wave, half-salute-like toss of the hand, and he joined me, and we went for the car. As we drove away, I looked back. One of them was reading what Ernie had written in his book. As he finished, there was a roar of laughter. You couldn't hear it, but you knew it was there. And some passing moron probably thought they were looking at pornographic pictures. Home. A couple of short ones, a little light talk, and then to bed. Ernie showed me to my room, his room. I thought I should take the guest room in the garage. I told Ernie I didn't want to take his room. He said that it was just a mock-up of a room to him, that he slept out in the garage. It was his sanctum. I put out the lights and crawled into bed, but couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of that verbal portrait of Ernie's. Mock-up of a room, his sanctum. To me, a mock-up was a model of an airplane, built to scale that couldn't fly. A sanctum, a retreat, or a place of refuge. To Ernie, it must have once been a beautiful, graceful airplane. Then suddenly something horrible happened, and it became too big to get out of the house. But you could get away from it, in the garage. A sanctum for a poor, lost guy. A door opened, the door across the hall. Soft, bed-slippered footsteps padded toward the kitchen. A door opened and softly closed. I turned on the light and looked around for something to read. I picked up a book on a table across the room, crawled back to the bed with it, and I heard the kitchen door open, the footsteps getting closer, and just as they were passing into the room across the hall, the faint tinkle in a glass. Then the door closed, softly. And I remembered that slight stagger as she left the room when we first met. I opened the book. It was Ernie's Brave Men, and I read the prelude. In solemn salute to those thousands of our comrades, great brave men that they are, for whom there will be no homecoming, ever. I started to read and became fascinated. I read on and on until early in the morning, with but 2 interruptions. The door quietly opening, the bed-slippered footsteps, the tinkle of the glass, the door closing, and silence. Sometimes you can hear silence. Early in the morning, I awoke. I never was a day sleeper. I washed and dressed and stole out of my bedroom. The door across the hall was very quiet. Ernie was sound asleep in his sanctum. I went into the kitchen, and the coffee pot was on the stove already prepared. I lit the gas and went outside for the morning paper. There it was, all screwed up with the heads, just as they were all over the country, never in the middle of the walk. On my second cup, and just getting into the sports section, the doorbell rang. I answered it, and there was that man again, Mr. Cowan. He shook my hand, acted as if I were a long-lost brother, and breezed right by me on his way to the garage. I stood there like a goof with my mouth open as I heard him awaken Ernie. "Howdy, Ernie, old boy! You missed me?" Well, I'll be a dirty so-and-so. That guy is incredible. They both came out in a few minutes, Ernie half asleep, and in an old bathrobe, and Cowan talking like a magpie. The strange thing about it was that Ernie wasn't annoyed or bored by his chatter, but seemed very amused. He acted as if he liked him, so I guess it must be me. There must be something down deep, way down deep, that I haven't recognized. Ernie cooked us a man's breakfast, but I noticed he started off with a Bloody Mary. Cowan and I stuck with the orange juice, unadulterated. After breakfast, Ernie started to unwind. He told me of men and kids that were men that had been killed fighting our war, and a lot about a lot that were alive and still fighting. He talked about D-Day, the medics, the engineers, artillerymen, dive bombers, and of course, the infantry. He took us into England, to Italy, Africa, France. It was a hell of a tour. Funny, always exciting, sometimes heartbreaking. And through it all, Lester never said a word. And I was beginning to locate that something. Ernie talked all morning, during luncheon and well into the afternoon, despite the annoyance of a jalopy that kept clanking by every half hour on the dot. It had passed the trying to sell me period, and it was now a man emptying his heart. My reaction was a strange one. For me, I began to wonder if I was good enough. Ernie sensed that something was wrong and asked me point blank if I was becoming interested in the story. I said, Christ, yes, but I was trying to make up my mind if I was the best man for the job. I had always felt to make a really fine picture, one must know all about the people. Flyers, I know. I was one of them. From the beginning, right through to the end, with all the joys and sorrows and crazy living that went with it. But I didn't know one single foot soldier intimately. I was not in love with the infantry, and I didn't agree at all with their attitudes toward the flyer. I think they called them flyboys. God damn it, it's so easy to fight if you have a couple of guys right alongside you, but try this sometime when you're all alone up there and there's a way out. Which route will you take? Nobody is going to know except yourself. There's a horrible afterbirth when you've taken the easy one. I happen to know. This kind of stopped things for a while. It was very quiet in the living room. The jalopy had been circling Ernie's block for the last hour, now sounded like a Big Mac truck. Ernie couldn't stand it any longer, and with a, "I'll chase that bastard out of here," stormed out the front door. Lester had to go places, and I was alone trying to figure out what to do. And I wasn't sure of myself. I didn't want to bollocks this one up. I started to walk over to the window to hear how Ernie was making out, and I heard the bed-slippered footsteps again. I turned around and got a flash of her as she passed by on her way to her room. I'm sure she didn't even see me. She looked as if she was walking in her sleep. A few minutes passed by, and Lester came back into the room. He asked me what I thought of Ernie. Before I could answer, Ernie came in from the street. He was no longer angry. There was a sadness on his face. He looked at me and said, "Do you know what that was?" An old man and his wife. They had driven through 3 states just to thank me for a lousy little paragraph I'd written about the death of their son. I asked them to come in, but they refused. They said they just wanted to thank me and drove away. Poor Ernie. A pathetic little guy with 50,000 obligations and one great personal tragedy. I knew I was going to make that picture. 3 weeks later, Ernie came to Hollywood. The script of G.I. Joe had been completed, and now the polishing job. And Ernie was to be the shine boy. We worked together day after day, and it gradually became a great shooting script. Cruel, factual, unaffected, genuine, and with a heart as big as Ernie's. This was the story of G.I. Joe. The night before Ernie was to leave back to the South Pacific was an unforgettable evening. There was a deadline to it. My wife Dottie and I invited Ernie's old friend and fellow newspaperman Gene Fowler for dinner. After dinner, Gene and I were to drive into Los Angeles in time for Ernie to catch his train to San Francisco, his port of embarkation. Those few hours were filled with vivid bits from the lives of 2 great reporter-writers, Gene Fowler and Ernie Pyle, discussing the days of the past, days and characters they knew so well. We all sat in awe. It was an experience given to but a chosen few. It was history that laughed and cried and ended too soon. Time to go. The goodbyes, the wish you lucks, and through it all, Ernie remained seated. Dottie, Gene, and I started for the hallway. I realized that Ernie was not with us. He was still seated. I went back to him and I said, "Come on, Ernie boy, we got to get cracking." He looked up at me and he said, Bill, I can't move. I took that one too many." Looking back at it, I often wondered if that was the real reason. Maybe Ernie had found another sanctum. Dottie, my kids, a happy home. And he wanted to hang on as long as he could. Even if they weren't his, they represented what he had always longed for. "Okay, Ernie, let's go." And I helped him up, and we started out to the car. Dottie and Gene were waiting at the open door. As we passed Dottie, Ernie reached for her hand, held it for a silent moment, then his voice, as clear as a bell but strangely quiet, said, "Dottie, you'll never see me again." They were like the last words of a condemned man. Dottie was speechless, so was Gene, and so was I. It was liable to spill over, so I hurried him out to the car. Gene and I tucked him in, nice and comfy, and before we could get the car started, Ernie had fallen asleep. As we drove out of the driveway, Dottie stood there all alone, watching us go. She waved goodbye to a slumbering Ernie. Ernie Pyle off to San Francisco, then the South Pacific, then destination unknown. The Story of G.I. Joe was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Robert Mitchum's only career Oscar nomination. But Ernie Pyle never got a chance to see the film. He died on April 18, 1945, killed by enemy fire during the Battle of Okinawa. At the time of his death, Pyle was one of the most read columnists in America, and his passing was noted by President Harry Truman, who said of him, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as the American fighting man wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen." There are 8 million stories in the cinema cities. This has been one.